The eviction notice is taped to the front door when Richard arrives home from what used to be his office. 48 years old, Harvard MBA, 23 years building a consulting empire that collapsed in 6 months of bad decisions, market crashes, and betrayals by partners he trusted like brothers. Everything gone. The company, the house, the BMW, the reputation, even his wife's faith in the man she married. Richard sits in his driveway, staring at the yellow paper that makes official what he's known for weeks. He's lost everything that once defined him. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Chen has nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, nothing left to prove. And in that emptiness, something unexpected begins to grow. You've been here, haven't you? That place where all your securities crumble, where the identity you've spent decades constructing dissolves like sugar in rain. Where you discover that everything you thought was solid was actually built on sand. Where poverty becomes the most honest teacher you've ever had. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I used to think this was consolation for people who couldn't afford better circumstances. A spiritual participation trophy for those who'd failed at material success. But sitting with Richard in his empty house, I began to understand something different. Poverty of spirit isn't about lacking money. It's about recognizing that everything you've been clinging to was never yours to begin with. I spent 23 years accumulating things, Richard tells me 3 months later, when we meet at a coffee shop he can no longer afford. Not just money and possessions, but achievements, connections, status symbols that I thought proved my worth. When it all disappeared, I panicked. Because if I wasn't successful, Richard Chen, the consultant everyone respected, then who was I? I had to learn to be just Richard, and I had no idea who that was. The first month after losing everything, Richard applied for unemployment benefits for the first time in his life, standing in line at the social services office, surrounded by people he'd never noticed before. He felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: humility. Not humiliation, though there was plenty of that, but humility. The recognition that he was no different from anyone else trying to survive, trying to hold their life together with whatever resources they could find. In that line, Richard remembers, I realized I'd been living in a bubble. I thought my success made me special, made me immune to the struggles that other people faced. But poverty is the great equalizer. It strips away everything artificial and shows you what's actually real. Richard's job search was brutal. At 48, overqualified for entry-level positions, too expensive for companies cutting costs. He faced rejection after rejection. The network he'd spent decades building suddenly had no time for his calls. But something else was happening. With nothing left to protect, Richard began connecting with people he'd never seen before. The security guard at the office building where he interviewed, the single mother applying for the same position, the elderly man who shared his table at the library where Richard spent his days searching job boards. When you have nothing to offer people except your attention, Richard reflects, you discover that attention is actually the most valuable gift of all. 6 months into his unemployment, Richard started volunteering at a food bank. Not for networking or resume building, but because he finally understood what it felt like to need help. I used to write checks to charity, he says. I thought that was enough. But when you're on the receiving end of charity, you learn the difference between giving money and giving yourself. The people at the food bank didn't need my business expertise. They needed my hands to sort vegetables and my voice to treat them with dignity. There, among people society had labeled failures, Richard discovered a kind of wealth he'd never imagined. Stories of resilience that humbled his complaints. Generosity from people who had almost nothing. Wisdom from those who'd learned to find joy in small mercies. I met Maria, a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren on minimum wage, who taught me more about financial planning than my MBA ever did. Not because she knew about markets and investments, but because she knew how to make $15 stretch for a week. I met James, a veteran with PTSD, who showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that builds empires, but the kind that gets up every morning when getting up feels impossible. 8 months after losing everything, Richard got a job. Not the executive position he'd been seeking, but a coordinator role at the non-profit where he'd been volunteering. The salary was a fraction of what he'd earned before, but for the first time in years, Richard felt rich. I realized I'd been confusing wealth with worth, he tells me. I thought having more made me more, but poverty taught me that I am enough just as I am. Not because of what I've accomplished or accumulated, but because I'm a beloved child of God. And that's true whether I'm living in a mansion or sleeping in my car. The Beatitudes aren't consolation prizes for life's losers. They're invitations to discover the upside-down economics of the kingdom of heaven. Where poverty of spirit becomes the prerequisite for divine filling. Where empty hands are the only hands capable of receiving what God wants to give. Where losing everything becomes the pathway to finding what actually matters. Richard's marriage didn't survive the financial collapse, but in the rubble of that relationship, he discovered something more valuable: the ability to love without conditions, without quid pro quo, without the need to impress or control. I'm dating again, he tells me with a smile that's different from the confident grin I remember from his successful days. But this time, I'm not trying to prove I'm worthy of love. I'm just trying to learn how to give it. Poverty taught me that I don't have to earn affection. I just have to receive it. Tonight, maybe you're facing your own eviction notice. Maybe everything you've built is crumbling. Maybe the securities you've counted on are proving as reliable as mirages. Maybe you're discovering that poverty isn't just about money. It's about recognizing that you're not the author of your own story, not the master of your own fate, not as in control as you thought. Maybe that recognition terrifies you, or maybe it's beginning to feel like freedom. Because a poverty of spirit isn't the absence of value. It's the recognition that your value comes from being loved, not from what you've achieved. It's the understanding that empty hands are the most honest posture before God. That acknowledgement of need is the beginning of every authentic prayer. That the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who know they can't buy their way in. In the silence that follows, listen for the sound of your own emptiness. It's not the echo of failure. It's the space where grace can finally enter.